The gunshot didn't kill me. It killed the last shred of my mercy. The man standing in my doorway dropped before he could even blink, his life snuffed out by a suppressed round that sounded like nothing more than a heavy cough in the dark. My living room was flooded with shadows in tactical gear, but these weren't Gone Woo's ghosts. These were Sung J. Kang's predators. I wasn't being saved, I was being collected. Sung Jae didn't want my gratitude. He wanted the keys to the most dangerous digital archive in Asia. I had traded a ghost for a wolf.
Okay, let's be real. The stakes just went from a personal grudge to a full-blown digital apocalypse. Maria is trapped in a billionaire's black site. Her parents are drifting on a rigged container ship in the middle of the ocean, and the most powerful police chief in Seoul has her face on every wanted screen in the country. We're about to dive into a 40-minute chess match where one wrong keystroke doesn't just crash a server, it ends a bloodline. This isn't just a survival story anymore. It's a masterclass in how an invisible woman uses high-intensity signal jammers and leaked Bitcoin dossiers to burn down the very system that tried to bury her. But before we track that ship's uplink into the Yellow Sea, I need to know your take. Is Maria still the hero here, or is she becoming a bigger monster than the ghost she's hunting? Drop a Team Shadow in the comments if you're riding with her new empire, or Too Far if you think she's losing her soul. While you're down there, smash that like button and subscribe with the bell on. It's the only way to ensure you're in the room when her final dead man switch hits 0. You've got your front row seat to the collapse of a dynasty. Let's see if Maria survives the fallout. The clock starts right now. They moved me the way surgeons move an organ, with precision, with insulation, with no regard for anything except preservation of function. 6 men, 2 flanking, 2 sweeping the hall, 1 on comms, and 1 whose only job appeared to be watching me. Not the exits, not the threat vectors, me. That told me everything about Sung J. Kang's organizational psychology. His assets were his primary security concern, and I was now an asset. The exfil took 11 minutes, a windowless cargo lift to a basement level I hadn't known existed underneath the city, an armored SUV that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. No blindfold, which was either arrogance or an invitation. I chose to read it as both. I've spent enough hours studying adversarial game theory to recognize when I'm inside someone else's decision matrix. In a zero-sum extraction, the captor removes sensory information, darkness, silence, disorientation, to erode the subject's strategic capacity. Sung Jae left my eyes open and my hands unbound. He didn't need to break me down. He was already betting I'd build myself back up in whatever direction served him. That's a far more sophisticated form of control than handcuffs. He was letting me think because he was confident my thinking would lead me to the same conclusion he'd already reached, that cooperation was the only rational move. I filed that calculation away and said nothing. We descended. Beneath the Gangnam district's postcard skyline, deep under the kind of glass tower that appears on the covers of financial magazines and the back pages of money laundering indictments, there was a room that hummed. Not metaphorically, literally hummed. The constant low-frequency thrum of servers, of cooling systems, of several petabytes of computing infrastructure doing the unsleeping work of a private intelligence apparatus. They call places like this black sites. I call them honest architecture. At least here, the power is visible. The space looked like a hybrid between a Pentagon situation room and a tech startup's wet dream. Curved display walls, gesture-responsive workstations, fiber optic cabling running beneath glass floors like luminescent veins. There were maybe 12 people in the room. None of them looked at me with curiosity. That meant they'd been briefed. That meant Sung Jae had been planning this moment for longer than I realized. He was standing with his back to me when I entered, watching a scrolling waterfall of encrypted financial data on the main display. Sung-jae Kang was fierce-looking, tattooed body, scarred face, wearing black pants and a gray vest, the kind of watch that cost more than my annual revenue at Sentinel Systems. Casual, but a countenance that reeks of menace. When he turned, his face held the particular expression of a man who had spent decades deciding other people's fates and had made peace with the transaction. "Maria," he said, the way you'd greet a colleague returning from a long trip, "we have a great deal to accomplish." He gestured to a workstation. On the screen, my files. Not copies, my actual encrypted partitions, already mounted. They had pulled the data from Sentinel's cloud backup before I'd even buckled into the SUV. "You've been extraordinarily productive. The police dossier alone is worth more than everything in Gunwoo Shin's offshore portfolio." I sat down, not because he told me to, because standing accomplishes nothing when you need to think. "You didn't bring me here to compliment my filing system." "No," he sat across from me, unhurried. "I brought you here because Gunwoo Shin still has 3 things I want: the assemblyman on his protection list, the offshore routing codes through Macau, and the Assemblyman Kim assassination evidence, which, according to my intelligence, only you can authenticate." I could. The authentication key was embedded in a steganographic layer inside a photograph of my parents taken at their 30th anniversary dinner, a personal piece of cryptography so human it was invisible to any algorithm that didn't know what it was looking for. I was about to tell him to be patient when the screen in front of me changed. It wasn't a hacked feed, it was a deliberate transmission. Gunwoo had sent it directly to every active IP address associated with my identity. He knew I was in this room. He had sources inside the Kang Syndicate's perimeter, or at minimum, inside its data routing. That was its own alarming intelligence. But what was on the screen was worse. A container ship, somewhere in the Yellow Sea, given the sky and the chop of the water. The camera feed was high resolution. Someone wanted me to see clearly. There were 3 people on screen, bound and seated in what appeared to be a cargo hold. My mother, my father, and Dr. Ha-Jun Lee, my therapist. Then Gunwoo's voice via satellite uplink, smooth and almost bored. "You destroyed my money. Now I destroy your world." The room around me went very still. Sung-jae leaned forward, and for the first time, something that wasn't calculation crossed his face. Even wolves can be surprised. I looked at the feed. My mother was sitting with her back straight, the way she always sat, as if posture were a form of armor. My father had his eyes closed. Dr. Ha-Jun was looking directly at the camera, and I knew, from 15 years of reading people across negotiating tables, that he was not looking at the lens. He was looking at me, telling me he was still thinking, still functioning, still fighting in the only way available to him. I took one breath, then I started working.
The ultimatum arrived exactly 4 minutes later. A text over satellite transmission decoded and rendered on my screen by the Kang Syndicate's Signals Intelligence Package. Gunwoo had applied a contact trace evasion protocol so thorough, it would have been impressive if it weren't being used to threaten my family. The message was brief and structured like a legal document, which was its own kind of menace. Delete the dead man's switch. Delete the police dossier in its entirety. Verify deletion via authenticated zero-knowledge proof within 6 hours. Failure to comply results in remote scuttling of vessel and all persons aboard. No negotiation, no extension, no appeal. 6 hours. I want you to understand something about panic, because I've spent a significant portion of my career studying the architecture of fear as it applies to decision-making under pressure. In game theory, there's a model called the prisoner's dilemma. 2 parties, each making a decision without knowing what the other will do. If both cooperate, both survive. If one defects, the defector gains and the cooperator suffers. If both defect, everyone loses. Gunwoo had designed this ultimatum as a classic defection trap. He was betting that love, for my parents, for Dr. Ha Jun, would make me cooperate, and in cooperating, I would hand him the only thing standing between him and freedom. The flaw in his reasoning was that he still believed I was playing a two-player game. I wasn't. I turned to Seung-jae. I need access to your full supercomputing cluster, not the user terminals, the substrate, direct API access to your parallel processing array. He looked at me. That infrastructure is classified. Your infrastructure, I said, is about to become the instrument that locates that ship. Or it isn't, and Gunwoo Shin scuttles my family, and then, because he's not stupid, he comes for you next. He knows I'm here. He always burns his witnesses. I paused. Your choice. Seung-jae was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he nodded to the technician on his left. What followed was 4 hours of the most intensive technical work I have ever performed, and I've performed it in conditions ranging from a Sao Paulo server farm during a power failure to a hotel bathroom in Macau with a satellite modem and a prayer. The Kang Syndicate's hardware was extraordinary, a proprietary parallel processing array running 2.4 petaflops of raw compute, custom-built for financial modeling and signals analysis. I was about to repurpose it as a maritime tracking engine. GPS was useless. Gunwoo had anticipated geolocation via satellite triangulation and had the ship running with its automatic identification system transmitter disabled, standard procedure for vessels engaged in the kind of shipping that doesn't benefit from visibility. Radar was useless at that range, without a satellite asset already positioned over the Yellow Sea, and the Kang Syndicate's radar contract with their private satellite operator had a 12-hour tasking window. I needed a different vector. Not GPS, not radar. Something Gunwoo hadn't thought to suppress, because it was too mundane to register as a threat. Refueling logs. Every commercial vessel, regardless of how dark it runs, requires bunker fuel. The global bunkering industry, heavy fuel oil for maritime propulsion, is one of the least digitized, least scrutinized corners of global logistics. But in the last decade, dark web markets serving sanctioned shipping routes, North Korean arms transshipment, Iranian crude smuggling, the kind of gray market maritime activity that governments tolerate because the alternative is worse, had developed their own quasi-regulatory ecosystems, encrypted ledgers, verified supplier networks, transactional records. This practice, which security analysts call ghost mapping, tracing a vessel's position by reconstructing its refueling history against known supplier coordinates, had been documented twice in academic literature, never in operational practice. I had been the one who wrote the second paper. I set the Kang array to work cross-referencing 3 datasets simultaneously: dark web bunkering ledgers accessed through an onion-routed scraper I'd built into the Sentinel system's architecture 18 months ago as a contingency, maritime insurance ghost registry filings out of Panama, where even vessels with suppressed identities require third-party liability coverage for hull damage, and satellite thermal emission signatures, which even a dark-running vessel produces through its engine stack, and the array could pull from a commercial Earth observation API I'd quietly licensed under a subsidiary entity 2 years prior. The supercomputing array took 47 minutes to triangulate, not a GPS coordinate, a probability cloud, a region of the Yellow Sea approximately 200 kilometers in diameter with a dense center where 3 data streams intersected. Within that center, one thermal emission signature consistent with a mid-size bulk carrier running at low speed, which is what you do when you're waiting rather than transiting. I had the ship. I found the ship using refueling logs on the dark web, but finding it and reaching it are 2 entirely different problems, and in the next 20 minutes, I was about to discover that my greatest threat wasn't on the water at all.
While my tracking routine ran, I had set a passive monitor on Sentinel Systems network traffic, a digital heartbeat check I run anytime I'm operating away from the building. The logic is simple. If someone is coming for your infrastructure, the first thing they do is probe it, a subtle shift in packet request patterns, an unusual authentication attempt, a minor anomaly in the IoT sensor reporting from the building's HVAC and access systems. Most operators miss these signals. I had built my company's security architecture specifically to surface them. At hour 2 of the 6-hour window, the heartbeat changed. Officer Moo-Jin Park had been on Shin Gun-woo's payroll for 11 years. I knew this not from intuition, but from a forensic accounting trail that June and I had reconstructed over 4 months. A series of cryptocurrency wallet addresses, Bitcoin with small amounts of Monero mixed in for obfuscation, that received regular deposits from shell accounts registered in the Cayman Islands, connected through 3 degrees of separation to the Shin Group's offshore treasury. I had included Moo-Jin's wallet addresses in the police dossier. Every transaction, every date, every amount, timestamped against his official duty roster to demonstrate a correlation between his Bitcoin receipts and the disappearance of evidence in 8 separate cases involving Shin Group interests. When I leaked the first 10% of that dossier to 4 investigative journalists, I hadn't done so yet, but I had it staged and ready. Moo-Jin's wallet history would be the first section they'd see. I had designed it that way on purpose, the most visceral financial evidence front-loaded, because I know how journalists read documents. They don't start at page 1. They search for the most damaging line. Moo-Jin, apparently, had come to the same conclusion about what exposure meant for him, because at 0214 in the morning, my building's IoT heartbeat showed me something that made my jaw tighten. 11 unauthorized access events in sequence, moving through Sentinel Systems' ground floor entry points in a pattern that bore zero resemblance to normal security rounds. They were moving tactically, sweeping the building sector by sector. A cleanup crew. They wanted to burn the physical servers, the on-premise backup infrastructure that housed the second-tier authentication keys for the dead man's switch. Without those keys, even if they destroyed the cloud architecture, the switch couldn't be disarmed. But with those keys, Gun-woo could potentially construct a countermeasure. Moo-Jin was buying insurance for his employer and for himself. I will admit to you, because this story demands honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable, that for approximately 40 seconds, I felt something close to despair. My parents on a ship in the Yellow Sea, a corrupt officer raiding my building, a wolf sitting 12 feet from me monitoring my every keystroke, 3 simultaneous problems, each of which could individually end everything I had built. In game theory, this is called multi-front pressure, and its primary strategic function is not to defeat you militarily, it's to exhaust your decision-making capacity, to force errors. I did not make an error. I opened a secondary console and accessed Sentinel Systems' building management system through the administrative backdoor I had installed during the building's initial IoT integration, a ghost account no contractor or audit had ever flagged because I had designed it to report as a routine firmware update daemon. From that console, I had complete control of every system in the building: lighting, HVAC, elevator controls, electromagnetic door locks, the fire suppression system, and the 12 exterior-facing cameras whose feeds I now routed directly to 3 destinations simultaneously. First, the National Police Agency's internal monitoring dashboard, which I accessed using a legitimate press pass credential I had obtained during a cybersecurity conference 2 years prior and never returned. Second, the sole bureau feeds for 4 international news agencies, 3 of which had correspondents awake at that hour because they were working the morning editorial cycle. Third, my own encrypted broadcast relay, which pushed the feed to 14 specific devices belonging to 14 specific lawmakers on the National Assembly's Police Oversight Committee. I had their personal device IDs from the dossier. They had apparently been corresponding extensively with Officer Mu Jin via personal, not official, messaging channels. I thought they'd be interested to see what their correspondent was doing at 2 in the morning. Then I triggered the building lockdown. All 11 electromagnetic door locks engaged simultaneously. The elevator went to the top floor and locked in place. The HVAC shifted to minimum ventilation, not dangerous, not cruel, but uncomfortable enough to heighten the psychological pressure of enclosure. The external camera's infrared illuminators flared, flooding the building exterior with invisible to human but camera-readable light, ensuring that the footage streaming to the National Police Agency and the international press was as crisp and well-lit as a studio production. Mu Jin's crew had 40 seconds before they understood what was happening. They spent those 40 seconds in exactly the way I had predicted, trying to communicate with whoever was coordinating the operation outside, discovering their encrypted radios were being tacitly recorded by the building's signal interception layer, another ghost system, and realizing that the building they had entered with the intention of destroying evidence was now a broadcast facility transmitting their faces, their equipment, and their coordinated tactical movements to the world. I identified Mu Jin on camera 3. He was standing in the server room corridor, his face cycling through the stages of a man whose strategic position has just been comprehensively dismantled. There's a specific quality to that expression, the moment when a person realizes that what they thought was a decision point is actually a trap closing behind them, and I have seen it often enough to recognize it across surveillance quality footage at 60 frames per second. He took out his phone. He started to dial. I cut cellular signal to the building's interior using the Faraday cage mode built into the shielded server room, a legitimate security feature designed to protect against electromagnetic eavesdropping, now repurposed as a communication blackout. His call didn't connect. By 0231, there were National Police Agency response units en route. Not Mu Jin's units, the other units, the Internal Affairs Division that had been building a separate, parallel case against police corruption for 18 months and had been waiting for a trigger sufficient to justify intervention without tipping off the compromised officers in the regular chain of command. I had been in quiet contact with their lead investigator for 6 weeks. He had asked me to let him know when I had something unambiguous. A live broadcast of a corrupt officer raiding a cybersecurity firm's servers at 2 in the morning transmitted simultaneously to the National Police Agency, the international press, and 14 members of the Legislative Oversight Committee, qualified as unambiguous. I sent him a 3-word message: watch Channel 7. At 0247, Mu Jin's public broadcast statement arrived, pre-written, clearly prepared in advance, which told me he had expected this contingency and had prepared for it before entering the building. His statement labeled me a national security threat. It accused Sentinel Systems of harboring classified intelligence belonging to a hostile foreign actor. It cited 3 specific statutory provisions under the National Security Act that would, if applied, grant the police emergency authority to seize my assets and detain me without warrant. It was, I will acknowledge, a well-constructed legal weapon. He had done his homework. The problem with legal weapons is that they require institutional legitimacy to fire, and at 0247, the institution that would have needed to authorize those provisions was watching its own officer on international news feeds, covered in tactical gear, surrounded by computers belonging to a private citizen with no warrant, no documentation, and no authorization chain that would survive a first-year law student's scrutiny. Mu Jin's statement lasted approximately 11 minutes as a credible document. Then the Internal Affairs Division issued its own statement, confirming that Officer Park Mu Jin and 3 senior detectives were being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending investigation. 4 hours later, arrest warrants were issued.
The Bitcoin evidence was not mentioned in the initial warrants. It didn't need to. The live footage was sufficient for immediate action. The Bitcoin evidence would be the foundation of the criminal case that would follow. I had designed it as a two-stage structure, spectacle first, substance second. The spectacle breaks the institutional dam. The substance fills the flood. I closed the building management console and turned back to my primary problem. 3 hours and 22 minutes remained on Gunwoo's ultimatum. I had a ship location and a disrupted police apparatus. What I needed now was a boarding operation.
I have always believed that truth on its own is a static object. It sits in a room and waits to be found, and in the time it takes people to find it, the people who fear it are busy redecorating. What truth needs in order to move is a distraction, something that makes the redecorators break cover, something that forces them into the open where the light can reach them. I released the first 10% of the police dossier at 0305. Not to the press, not yet. I seeded it through 14 separate dark web drops, each tagged with a different cryptographic signature that would allow me to trace which copy spread fastest, an information epidemiology experiment I had designed 2 years prior as an academic exercise and was now running at operational scale. The drops were deliberately imperfect, slightly different redaction levels, varying metadata, one copy with a minor timestamp discrepancy that would force any analyst trying to authenticate the material to compare versions, and in comparing, spread all 14 variants simultaneously. Within 40 minutes, the dossier was in the hands of 3 investigative newsrooms, 2 international intelligence monitoring services, 1 parliamentary researcher who I knew maintained a protected communications channel with the head of the National Assembly Ethics Committee, and, through a path I had specifically engineered, the internal communications system of Seoul Metropolitan Police's District 3 Bureau, which housed the 12 officers I believed to be the primary operational layer of Gunwoo's police network. The result was precisely what anyone who has studied the prisoner's dilemma in institutional settings would predict. The moment members of a corrupt network believe their colleagues have been exposed, the rational choice shifts from collective silence to individual self-preservation. The officers in District 3 did not coordinate a response. They each, individually, began making decisions in their own interest. Some called lawyers, some called senior officers, some called Gunwoo's associates to demand extraction agreements. All of these communications generated metadata. All of that metadata was being passively collected by 3 parties simultaneously: Internal Affairs, the Parliamentary Researchers' Encrypted Capture System, and my own monitoring relay. By 048, the District 3 Bureau was functionally in civil war. Officers refusing orders, chain of command collapsed. The 2 senior detectives most directly implicated by the Bitcoin evidence, one of whom had been Mujin's operational handler for 7 of the 11 years, attempted to destroy their own departmental computers. The attempt was logged and timestamped by the building's internal audit system before they could complete it, which added evidence tampering to the list of charges that Internal Affairs would ultimately file. Mujin himself was arrested at 0412 at a private residence in Sodamungu that was registered to a corporate entity with 3 degrees of separation from the Shin Group. The irony was not lost on me. The police apparatus was collapsing, Mujin was in handcuffs, but Gunwoo still had the ship, still had 3 people I loved, and the clock was at 1 hour 48 minutes, and I hadn't yet told Seung-jae what I was actually planning. I turned to Seung-jae. He had been watching my work with the expression of a man witnessing a chess player make 30 moves in sequence and struggling to track the logic of each one. "I need your maritime asset, the one you keep in the Yellow Sea." He was quiet. "I know about the trawler," I said. "It's registered under a shipping company in Busan that your second holding company acquired in 2019. It has a fast response tender that can reach the target vessel's probable position in 50 minutes at full speed. I know this because the same dark web bunkering ledgers I used to find Gunwoo's ship also contain resupply records for yours." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "What do you need?" 8 operators, the tender, and access to your drone inventory, specifically your jamming payload units." I want to be precise about what I was proposing because the technical architecture of what followed is important both as a description of what happened and as a lesson in how modern asymmetrical operations actually function. The popular conception of a drone strike involves kinetic munitions, weapons. What I was describing is fundamentally different and, in my view, more elegant. The Kang Syndicate maintained a fleet of long-range drone platforms for signals intelligence, surveillance primarily, but the platform was modular. The payload bay could carry a jamming array, a high-intensity broadband radio frequency disruption system capable of severing all wireless communications within a 400-meter radius. Gunwoo's remote detonation system for the ship's scuttling mechanism operated on a frequency-hopping spread-spectrum protocol, the same architecture used in military IED triggers. It was designed to resist conventional jamming because it constantly changes frequencies faster than a fixed jammer could track. But a broadband jammer doesn't track frequencies. It floods them all simultaneously, every frequency, all at once, at sufficient intensity to overwhelm any transmission attempting to pass through that electromagnetic space. If the jamming array reached the ship before Gunwoo triggered the detonator, his remote kill switch would be severed. Not jammed, severed. He would be holding a transmitter that was speaking into a wall. The second component was the ship's OS. Modern commercial vessels, and the kind of private gray market vessel Gunwoo was operating is no exception, run a navigational and systems management OS that in the last decade has migrated from isolated hardware controls to networked architectures. The reason is economic: remote monitoring, predictive maintenance, fuel efficiency optimization. The security architecture of these systems is, charitably, approximately 15 years behind the threat landscape. I had identified 3 published CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, in the specific OS variant most likely to be running on a vessel of that class, age, and registry profile.
I had built an exploit chain targeting all 3 vulnerabilities in sequence. The attack was designed to begin at the IP layer, propagate through the ship's internal network, reach the propulsion management module, and lock the scuttling actuators, the physical valves and charges responsible for flooding the hull, in a closed and inert state. It would not disable the ship. It would not harm anyone aboard. It would simply make the scuttling mechanism non-functional for the duration of the overwrite, approximately 20 minutes of sustained access. 20 minutes was more than enough time for 8 operators to take a bridge. "I'll need a satellite uplink to the drone for real-time OS injection," I told Seung-jae, "and I'll need the operators to follow a very specific breach sequence. The bridge first, not the cargo hold." I looked at him directly. "My people are in the cargo hold. If the bridge personnel understand that their command infrastructure is gone and their communications are severed, they will not risk a hostage. If you breach the cargo hold first, you are making a different calculation, and I won't be part of that operation." Seung-jae looked at me for a long moment. "You realize," he said slowly, "that even if this works, you will have just handed me a significant tactical debt." "I realize," I said, "that you were going to spend years and considerable resources trying to dismantle the Shin Empire from the outside. Tonight, I'm going to hand you its architect in a complete operational collapse, on record, confessing to the assassination of a serving assemblyman and with no institutional protection remaining. That is not a debt. That is a gift. What you do with it is your own business." He smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was a real one. The drone launched at 0438. The tender was already at sea. I tracked the drone's position on one screen and maintained the OS exploit chain on another, running the attack in a sandboxed pre-deployment state, staged and ready to execute but not yet transmitting because premature transmission would alert the ship's systems and potentially trigger a failsafe that Gunwoo had built into the detonation protocol. At 0451, the drone reached the outer edge of the jamming effective radius. I had 9 minutes before the 6-hour window closed.
I executed both operations simultaneously. The jamming array powered up, and I initiated the OS injection in the same keystroke. The broadband flood hit first, because radio frequency propagates at the speed of light. The OS exploit took 42 seconds to traverse the ship's internal network and reach the propulsion management module. 42 seconds during which Gun Wu, somewhere on that bridge, was pressing a trigger that was screaming into static. At 0453, the scuttling actuators locked. At 0457, the tender's operators breached the bridge. At 0502, the cargo hold was secured.
The feed from the tender's helmet cameras came through on the main display, and I watched my parents be guided out of a shipping container into the gray pre-dawn light of the Yellow Sea, with the particular clinical detachment that I have trained myself to apply to high-stakes monitoring. Detachment is not coldness. It is the mechanism by which I remain functional when the alternative is to fall apart on a keyboard that still has critical work running on it. My mother was speaking. I could see her mouth moving, but the audio was degraded. My father was upright, moving under his own power. Dr. Hajun had his hands clasped in front of him in a gesture I recognized from our first meeting, 18 months ago, when he had told me that what I was asking him to document might get us both killed. He had been right. He had done it anyway. Some people deserve more than gratitude. I didn't yet know how to give him what he actually deserved, but I knew I would spend considerable effort trying. Gon Wu was on the bridge. The operators brought him to camera at 0509, and the image that the feed rendered was so precisely calibrated to his worst fears that I almost felt the geometry of it. A man whose entire identity had been constructed around control, around invisibility, around the principle that he was the force that moved others and was never himself moved, now being held at arm's length by an operator half his age in a room that he had chosen as his stronghold, discovering that the stronghold had been disassembled around him in the course of a single night. He was not physically broken, he was strategically empty. There is a difference. Physical damage can be endured and recovered from. People survive extraordinary physical hardship because the human body is a remarkably persistent machine. Strategic emptiness is different. It is the condition of a person who has exhausted every move and found that each one led to a smaller cage than the last. I had put him there deliberately and methodically, and watching him arrive at that recognition was not satisfying in the way that people imagine triumph is satisfying. It was quieter than that, more like watching a calculation complete. I opened a direct audio channel to the bridge through the tender's communication system. "Gon Wu," I said. He looked at the camera for a long moment. "You should have taken the deal," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled, even now. I respected that in the narrow professional sense in which I respect any adversary who maintains composure at the terminal stage of a confrontation. "The deal was designed to ensure I couldn't rebuild after you destroyed my position," I said. "You understand leverage. You know that wasn't a deal. It was a disarmament agreement dressed in the language of a deal. So what is this? Your deal?" I said. His network was burning. His institutional protection was in handcuffs. His ship was taken. What I did next would determine not just his fate, but whether the truth about the Assemblyman Kim assassination would reach the people who deserved to know it. And I wasn't going to use a weapon. "This," I said, "is a broadcast." I had prepared for this moment the way I prepare for everything, with redundancy, with contingency, and with a clear understanding that the most durable form of justice is not the kind that requires sustained institutional enforcement, because institutions can be corrupted, as the previous 12 hours had comprehensively demonstrated.
but the kind that is witnessed so widely and by so many parties simultaneously that its suppression becomes more costly than its acceptance. I had established uplinks to 9 satellite news networks across the Asia-Pacific region. I had authenticated my identity to 3 of them in advance, providing them with the first section of the police dossier as proof of credibility. I had timed the activation of the broadcast to coincide with the early morning news cycle in Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan simultaneously, the highest viewership hour across the region, when editorial producers are most likely to run breaking content without the delay imposed by evening editorial committees. The broadcast was ready. It was waiting for Gun-woo to fill it. "Tell me about Assemblyman Kim," I said. He said nothing. His face was still controlled, but something shifted behind his eyes, the private calculation of a man assessing his options and finding them reduced to a single variable. He was not a man who would confess out of guilt or remorse. I had never expected him to be. But he was a man who, stripped of all other leverage, might confess as the last act of agency available to him. Not because confession absolved him, but because confession, on his terms, with his framing, delivered in his voice, was still his own act. The alternative was to be described, accused, and characterized by others indefinitely. I was offering him the chance to define the shape of his own ending. Some people find that compelling. I had calculated, correctly, that Gun-woo Shin was one of them. He talked for 19 minutes. He described the authorization chain for the Assemblyman Kim assassination in precise, unsolicited detail. Names, dates, the intermediary who had carried the instruction from Gun-woo to the contractor, the method by which the operation was staged to resemble a traffic accident. He described the role of 3 serving police officers and 1 sitting lawmaker in the subsequent cover-up. He described the offshore financial mechanism by which the contractor had been compensated, a structured property transaction in Macau, routed through a real estate holding company that I recognized immediately as the same entity that appeared in the 42nd page of the police dossier. Every word went out live across 9 networks in 4 languages with real-time closed captioning provided by the broadcast partner's own systems. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. This was not justice. Not entirely. Justice is a structured process with rules of evidence and standards of proof, and a system of appeal, and a theory of proportionality. What I delivered that morning was accountability, which is a different thing, rougher and less precise, and more immediately legible to the public than the proceedings that would follow. Accountability without justice is incomplete, but justice without accountability is invisible. I had provided the visibility. The formal structure would, I believed, follow. I was not wrong. Gun-woo was taken into custody by the South Korean Coast Guard at 0614, having been notified by the National Police Agency, the functional elements of it, the ones that had not been compromised, that a warrant for his arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, financial crimes, and corruption of public officials had been issued 37 minutes prior. The arrest of Officer Moo Jin and his associates, combined with the simultaneous collapse of Gun-woo's protection network, produced an institutional cascade that I had modeled but genuinely was not certain would fully materialize. 14 additional members of the Shin Group's affiliated network, corporate officers, political liaisons, 2 sitting members of a regional assembly, were named in the initial warrant as co-conspirators or material witnesses. 11 of them surrendered voluntarily within 48 hours, which told me they had been watching the trajectory of the night and had made their own prisoner's dilemma calculations. The 4 who did not surrender were arrested within 72 hours. The Shin Empire, which had taken 30 years and 3 generations to construct, took 72 hours to formally collapse. My parents arrived at Incheon International Airport at 0930 the same morning, escorted by 2 of Sung Jae's operators, who I had specifically requested remain with them until they were through customs and in a vehicle. My mother called me from the arrivals hall. I was still in the bunker. I told her I was fine and that I would see her in a few hours. She said, in the precise tone she has used since I was 7 years old, to communicate that she is not going to press me on a subject, but that the subject has not gone away. We will talk about all of this later. Yes, I said, we will. Dr. Ha-jun called 20 minutes later. He said nothing for a long moment, and then, I want to go back to my practice. You should. Go back to your practice. Take 3 weeks off first. And Ha-jun, the second tranche of the dossier goes public in 30 days. Your testimony will be needed for the evidentiary phase. I'll make sure you have counsel. I know. I already have counsel. And then he hung up, which was very Ha-jun. Sung Jae found me at 10:15, still at the workstation, running a systematic audit of every process I had initiated over the past 8 hours to ensure nothing was left unsecured and no operational trace pointed back to his infrastructure in a way that could cause him institutional problems. He stood behind me with his hands in his pockets, and I could feel the particular quality of his attention, the attention of a man who has just watched someone do something extraordinary and is now recalculating the value of their asset upward. The Shin Empire is gone, he said. Substantially, I agreed. The police dossier, the authentication keys, the broadcast infrastructure. He paused. You still control all of it. I do. And Gunwoo's offshore routing codes, the Macau infrastructure, the assemblyman on his protection list.
I turned to face him. He was smiling the same smile he had offered me hours ago. Real, not warm, the expression of a man who has made a very large calculation and arrived at a result he finds pleasing. I knew what the calculation was. I was the result. His digital architect, the person who would spend the next several years disassembling the networks his competitors had built, the same way I had just disassembled the Shin Group, from the inside, invisibly, with no fingerprints and complete deniability. He would provide the infrastructure, I would provide the methodology. Together, we would be the most powerful private intelligence operation in Northeast Asia. It was a genuinely compelling proposition. I stood up from the workstation. Before you make the offer you're about to make, I said quietly, there's something you should know. I reached into the workstation's secondary console, not the user terminal, the substrate layer, the direct API access he had granted me to his parallel processing array 8 hours ago, and I opened a file, a small one, less than 3 kilobytes, the kind of file that if you didn't know what you were looking at, you would mistake for a routine system process. 8 hours ago, I said, while I was mapping your supercomputing array's architecture to build the maritime tracking routine, I also spent about 4 minutes doing something else. Your network security is exceptional, really, genuinely best in class for a private organization. I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you represents no criticism of your technical team. I could see in his eyes the exact moment he understood. I built a dead man switch inside your infrastructure. It's mapped to your servers, your financial architecture, your client lists, your operational files, everything I was able to access from that substrate layer over the past 8 hours, which is more than you probably realize. It's on a 72-hour heartbeat. Every 72 hours, it needs a specific input from me to remain dormant. If I miss a cycle, if I'm unable to provide that input for any reason, it releases everything to the same broadcast infrastructure I used tonight. Every network, every regulator, every investigative journalist who covered the Shin collapse. Sung Jae was very still. I'm not your architect. I'm not anyone's architect. I'm a free agent, and as long as I remain one, the switch stays dormant. That's not a threat, it's a structural guarantee, the same kind of guarantee that keeps sovereign states from attacking each other when they both have second strike capability, mutually assured disclosure. I picked up my bag. The workstation behind me was clean. I had taken nothing and left nothing, except the one small file that was now the most important file in the Kang Syndicate's architecture. "You're remarkably dangerous," Sung Jae said. His voice was even. He was a man who, I believed, genuinely admired a well-executed strategy, even when it was executed against him. "I know," I said. I walked out of the bunker, into the elevator, up through the glass tower, and out into the early morning streets of Seoul, where the city was waking up to a news cycle unlike anything it had seen in a generation, and where no one, not Gunwoo's remnant network, not Sung Jae's operators, not anyone still looking for leverage over Maria Yates, knew exactly where I was going. I didn't have a destination, not yet. For the first time in 2 years, I had nothing to run toward or nothing actively pursuing me. I was invisible in the best possible sense of the word. Not absent, not hidden, not suppressed, but simply unlocatable, free. Somewhere in a Seoul precinct, Officer Moo Jin was being processed. Somewhere in international waters, Gunwoo Shin was being read his rights. Somewhere in Apgujeong, my parents were having breakfast and trying to understand what their daughter had become. Somewhere in the Kang Syndicate servers, a small file was counting down 72 hours. And somewhere in the city, in its coffee shops, its editorial rooms, its parliamentary corridors, its police stations, its corporate boardrooms, the truth was spreading at the speed of a network that no one owned and no one controlled. That was enough. For now, that was enough. I turned up my collar against the morning cold and walked into the city like I owned it, because in the only way that mattered, I did.
The ghost is in a cell, the wolf is on a leash, and Maria Yates just walked out into the Seoul night as the most dangerous free agent on the planet. She didn't just survive the game, she rebuilt the entire board. But here's the real question. Now that she holds the kill codes to every secret in the city, do you think she'll use that power to do good? Or has she finally become a bigger monster than the men she just destroyed? I'm heading down to the comments right now to see who's Team Maria and who's actually terrified of what she's become. If you're still catching your breath after that finale, do yourself a favor, smash that like button and subscribe with the notification bell pinned to all. You do not want to be the only one left in the dark when our next story drops, because we've got more high-stakes narratives coming that make this look like a warm-up. This channel is for the ones who see the shadows before everyone else does. Maria's world is expanding. Make sure you're here to see who falls next. See you in the next one.